Have you ever wondered how something as horrifying as slavery became so deeply ingrained in human history? It's a story that spans nearly every continent and culture, a dark thread woven into the fabric of our past. From the grand empires of antiquity to the fields of the New World, the practice of owning another human being has left an indelible mark on our collective story. This isn't just a tale of oppression. It's also a story of incredible resilience, resistance, and the enduring human quest for freedom. Today, we're going to journey through this long and complex history to understand its origins, its evolution, and its lasting legacy. It's a difficult topic, but one we must confront to truly understand the world we live in today. The story of slavery begins not with a single event, but with the very dawn of organized society. As early as 11,000 years ago, with the rise of agriculture, the concepts of land ownership and surplus created social hierarchies. War, which had always existed, now had a new prize: captives. Instead of being killed, prisoners of war were often enslaved, forced to labor for their captors. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest deciphered writings from ancient Mesopotamia, dating back to around 1750 BCE, already laid out laws governing the ownership and sale of slaves. It treated them as property, something to be bought, sold, or inherited, just like cattle or land. This legal framework normalized the institution, embedding it into the very structure of these early civilizations. In ancient Greece, a society we often celebrate for its contributions to democracy and philosophy, slavery was an accepted and essential part of life. It's estimated that in Athens, at its peak, as much as a third of the population were slaves. They worked in every sector, toiling in silver mines, tending to fields, serving in households, and even working as artisans. Philosophers like Aristotle, while pondering the nature of freedom, argued that some people were slaves by nature, a disturbing justification that would be echoed for centuries. Similarly, the Roman Empire was built on the backs of millions of enslaved people. Massive conquests supplied a constant stream of captives who fueled Rome's colossal construction projects, worked its vast agricultural estates, and served the Roman elite. The famous rebellion led by the gladiator, Spartacus, was a powerful but ultimately tragic testament to the desperation and brutality of Roman slavery. As we move into the medieval period, the nature of slavery began to shift. In Europe, the fall of the Roman Empire led to the rise of feudalism, and chattel slavery was gradually replaced by serfdom. Serfs were not owned outright as property, but they were tied to the land and owed labor to a lord. They had some rights, but their freedom was severely restricted. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, a vast and sophisticated slave trade network flourished. Spanning from Africa across the Middle East and into Asia, this trade involved millions of people. While Islamic law granted slaves certain protections and even pathways to freedom, the reality was often harsh. Enslaved people served as soldiers, administrators, and domestic servants, with a particularly high demand for eunuchs and female concubines. The Trans-Saharan slave trade, for example, saw countless Africans forcibly marched across the desert, a brutal journey that many did not survive. The story takes another dramatic and devastating turn with the age of exploration in the 15th century. This is when the Transatlantic Slave Trade began, a system of enslavement on a scale and of a brutality previously unimaginable. European powers, initially Portugal and Spain, and later Britain, France, and the Netherlands, established colonies in the Americas. They needed a massive labor force to work on lucrative sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. At first, they tried to enslave indigenous populations, but disease and resistance made this unsustainable. So they turned to Africa. This created the infamous triangular trade. European ships would carry manufactured goods to Africa to trade for enslaved people, then transport those captive Africans across the Atlantic in the horrific journey known as the Middle Passage, and finally carry plantation crops back to Europe. The Middle Passage was a nightmare of unimaginable suffering. Millions of men, women, and children were packed into the dark, filthy holds of ships, chained together with barely any room to move. Disease, starvation, and extreme violence were rampant. It's estimated that up to 2 million people died during the crossing alone. Those who survived were sold at auctions in the Americas, torn from their families, and forced into a life of brutal labor. Their names were taken, their cultures suppressed, and their humanity denied. To justify this barbarity, European colonizers developed racist ideologies, creating a false narrative that Africans were subhuman and destined for servitude. This racialized form of slavery was different from what had come before. It was a permanent, inherited status based solely on the color of one's skin. For over 4 centuries, the transatlantic slave trade devastated West and Central Africa, depopulating entire regions and destroying societies. It enriched European nations and built the economies of the Americas. The wealth generated from slave labor fueled the Industrial Revolution in Europe, creating a global economic system in which the exploitation of African people was a foundational element. But enslaved people never simply accepted their fate. Resistance was constant and took many forms. It could be subtle, like working slowly, breaking tools, or preserving cultural traditions and languages in secret. It could also be overt and violent, with countless uprisings and rebellions shaking the foundations of the slave system. From the Haitian Revolution, where enslaved people successfully overthrew French colonial rule and established the first independent Black republic, to Nat Turner's rebellion in the United States, the fight for freedom was relentless. The tide began to turn in the late 18th and early 19th centuries with the rise of the abolitionist movement. Inspired by Enlightenment ideals of liberty and human rights and fueled by the powerful testimonies of formerly enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano and Frederick Douglass, activists in Europe and the Americas began to campaign against the slave trade and slavery itself. Religious groups, particularly the Quakers, were at the forefront of this moral crusade. It was a long and difficult struggle. Great Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery in its empire in 1833. In the United States, the institution was so deeply entrenched, particularly in the South, that it took a bloody civil war to end it with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, finally doing so in 1888. But the official end of slavery did not mean the end of oppression or forced labor. In the United States, the period of Reconstruction was followed by the era of Jim Crow laws, a system of racial segregation and discrimination that kept African Americans in a state of second-class citizenship for another century. In colonial Africa and Asia, European powers simply replaced chattel slavery with other forms of coercive labor like indentured servitude, where people were bound by contract to work for little to no pay for a set number of years, often in conditions that were barely better than slavery. The legacy of slavery is profound and far-reaching. It has created deep-seated racial inequalities that persist to this day. From wealth gaps and housing discrimination to systemic racism in policing and justice systems, the psychological scars of centuries of dehumanization continue to affect communities around the world. Shockingly, slavery is not just a thing of the past. According to modern estimates, over 50 million people are living in conditions of modern slavery right now. This includes human trafficking, where people are tricked or forced into exploitation, forced labor in factories, farms, and fishing boats; debt bondage, where people are trapped trying to repay an impossible loan; forced marriage. It exists in every country, hidden in plain sight, in the supply chains of products we use every day. The fight for freedom is not over. Understanding this long, dark history isn't about assigning guilt. It's about recognizing the truth of our shared past. It's about honoring the millions of lives that were stolen and the incredible strength of those who resisted. And it's about inspiring us to continue the fight against all forms of slavery and injustice that still exist today. We must learn from the past to build a better, more just future for everyone. Thank you for watching. If this history is important to you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the stories that have shaped our world.